The veiled woman stepped off the stage in Laredo, Texas, in the summer of 1872, and every eye in the dusty street turned toward her like iron filings to a magnet. Wilhelmina Thorne kept her gloved hands folded at her waist, her entire face obscured by layers of black lace that fell from the brim of her wide hat down past her shoulders. She had worn that veil for 12 years, since she was 18 years old, and the weight of it had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The stage driver handed down her single trunk with a grunt, eyeing her with poorly concealed curiosity. She had grown used to the stares, the whispers that followed her like a shadow. In St. Louis, they had called her the Veiled Widow, though she had never been married. In Kansas City, children had run from her, convinced she was a ghost. Here in Laredo, she hoped only for indifference, a place where the brutal Texas heat and the harsh demands of survival might leave people with less time for gossip. "Hotel is that way, madam," the driver said, pointing down the main street with a tobacco-stained finger. "Only one in town worth staying at, anyhow." "Thank you," Wilhelmina said, her voice muffled slightly by the fabric. She lifted her trunk herself, ignoring the driver's half-hearted offer to help, and began walking down the rutted street. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and beneath the veil, sweat began to gather on her skin. But she would not remove it. She could never remove it. The hotel was a 2-story structure with a faded sign that read, Laredo House. She pushed through the door into the relative coolness of the lobby, where a balding man behind the desk looked up from his newspaper. His eyes widened at the sight of her, but to his credit, he managed a professional smile. "Need a room, miss?" "Yes, please. Indefinitely, if possible. I'm looking for work as well. I'm a seamstress." The clerk nodded slowly. "We got rooms available. As for work, you might try Mrs. Henderson's dress shop on 2nd Street. She's always looking for help, what with all the ranchers' wives wanting fancy gowns from back east." He paused, then added delicately, "She would not mind about the veil, neither. Lost her own husband to fever last year. Understands grief, if you catch my meaning." Wilhelmina did not correct his assumption. Let him think she was mourning. It was easier than the truth. "Thank you. I will call on her tomorrow." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that overlooked the street. Wilhelmina set down her trunk and moved to the window, looking out at the unfamiliar town. Laredo was rough and unpolished, a border town that had seen its share of violence and hardship. But there was life here, too. She could see it in the way people moved with purpose, in the sound of laughter drifting from the saloon, in the smell of bread from a nearby bakery. She unpinned her hat carefully, but the veil remained in place, secured by smaller pins that held it close to her face and neck. Even alone, she kept it on, especially alone. She could not bear to see her own reflection, to remember what she had become. That night, she lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the sounds of the town settling into darkness. Dogs barked in the distance, a piano played in the saloon. Somewhere, a baby cried. And Wilhelmina Thorne, behind her veil of black lace, allowed herself a few silent tears for the life she had lost 12 years ago, for the girl she had been before the fire. The next morning, she presented herself at Mrs. Henderson's dress shop precisely at 9 o'clock. The widow Henderson was a stout woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and capable hands. She looked at Wilhelmina's veil with sympathy rather than fear, which was a relief. "Can you sew a straight seam?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Yes, madam. I can do everything from basic repairs to beadwork and embroidery." "Show me." Mrs. Henderson produced a length of calico and a needle and thread. Wilhelmina sat down at the work table and, working by feel through her gloves, produced a line of stitching so fine and even that Mrs. Henderson nodded with satisfaction. "You will do. 6 days a week, 8 to 5, with an hour for dinner. $1 a day to start, more if you prove yourself. Can you start today?" "Yes, madam." And so Wilhelmina began her new life in Laredo. She worked in the back room of the shop, away from customers who might be unsettled by her appearance, and her needlework was so exquisite that Mrs. Henderson soon raised her pay to $1.50. She took her meals in her hotel room, avoiding the dining room and its curious stares. She spoke to almost no one except Mrs. Henderson and the hotel clerk. It was a lonely existence, but it was safe, and safety was all Wilhelmina had left to hope for. 3 weeks after her arrival, Mrs. Henderson mentioned that she needed supplies brought down from her ranch, some 30 miles north in the rougher country where the desert began to give way to rocky hills. My nephew usually does it, but he is laid up with a broken leg, Mrs. Henderson explained. I need someone reliable to make the trip. There is a man who brings goods down from the hills sometimes, sells furs and such. Goes by the name of Tobias Irving. Lives up in the high country like a hermit, but he is honest and strong as an ox. If you can find him and convince him to help, I will pay both his fee and give you a bonus. Wilhelmina hesitated. The thought of traveling into the wilderness, of seeking out a stranger, filled her with anxiety. But Mrs. Henderson had been kind to her, and she wanted to repay that kindness. Where would I find this Mr. Irving? He comes into town about once a month to trade. Should be due any day now. Usually camps outside town rather than staying at the hotel. Too rough for civilization, that one. But do not let that scare you. He has never caused trouble, just keeps to himself. 2 days later, word came that the mountain man was in town. Wilhelmina closed up the shop at 5 o'clock, and gathering her courage, made her way to the trading post where Mrs. Henderson said he would be. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the heat was finally breaking. The trading post was a ramshackle building that smelled of leather and tobacco and animal pelts. Behind the counter, a grizzled old man was tallying accounts while a handful of men lounged on barrels and crates, talking in low voices. Their conversation stopped when Wilhelmina entered, and she felt the familiar prickle of eyes on her veiled face. "Help you, miss?" the proprietor asked. "I'm looking for Mr. Tobias Irving. I was told he might be here." One of the men on the barrels jerked his thumb toward the door. "Outside, around back, got his furs laid out." Wilhelmina nodded her thanks and stepped back into the evening air. She walked around the side of the building and stopped short at the sight before her. Tobias Irving was crouched beside a pile of pelts, his back to her, and even in that position, she could see the sheer size of him. He was massive, with shoulders that strained the worn fabric of his buckskin shirt and arms thick with muscle. His hair was dark and long, hanging past his collar, and his hands as he sorted the furs were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who lived by hard work. He wore a knife at his belt, and a rifle leaned against the building within easy reach. As if sensing her presence, he turned, and Wilhelmina found herself looking up at a face that was as rugged as the country he came from. Tobias Irving was perhaps 30 years old, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of beard, a straight nose that looked like it had been broken at least once, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He was, she realized with a start, handsome in a raw, untamed way that made her breath catch. His eyes fixed on her veil, but unlike most people, he did not stare. He simply stood, rising to his full height, which had to be well over 6 feet, and waited for her to speak. "Mr. Irving?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "That would be me." His voice was deep, rough from lack of use, but not unkind. "My name is Wilhelmina Thorne. I work for Mrs. Henderson at the dress shop. She needs supplies brought down from her ranch and was hoping you might be available for hire." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see more than most people, even through her veil. "When?" "As soon as possible." She said she would pay your usual rate. "I charge $5 for a trip like that, plus expenses." She said that would be acceptable. He nodded slowly. "I will be heading back up that way tomorrow at dawn. Tell Mrs. Henderson I will stop by her ranch and bring down whatever she needs. Should be back in 4 or 5 days." "Thank you, Mr. Irving." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "You planning to go up there yourself?" She looked back at him. "I had not thought about it." "Why?" "Mrs. Henderson's ranch is on the way to the high country. Might be you would want to see the supplies yourself. Make sure they are what she needs. Save time if something is wrong." Wilhelmina hesitated. The thought of days in the wilderness with this stranger should have terrified her, but there was something about Tobias Irving's steady gaze that felt oddly safe. "Would that be acceptable to you?" "Makes no difference to me. But it will be rough traveling. You would have to keep up." "I can keep up," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Dawn, then. Meet me at the livery stable. Bring only what you can carry." That night, Wilhelmina lay awake questioning her decision. She barely knew this man. He lived in the wilderness like an animal, probably had no manners, no education. But Mrs. Henderson trusted him, and Wilhelmina had learned to trust Mrs. Henderson's judgment. Besides, she thought, What did she have to fear? She had already lost everything that mattered. At dawn, she presented herself at the livery stable with a small pack containing a change of clothes, some basic necessities, and her sewing kit. Tobias Irving was already there, loading supplies onto a sturdy pack mule. He had 2 horses saddled and ready. "You ride?" he asked. "Yes." "Good." He helped her into the saddle with a hand under her elbow, and even through the layers of her dress and his rough touch, she could feel the strength in him. They set out as the sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, riding north out of Laredo into country that grew increasingly wild and beautiful. For the first few hours, they rode in silence. Tobias led the way, clearly knowing the trail by heart, and Wilhelmina followed, watching the landscape change around them. The flat scrubland gave way to rolling hills, then to rocky outcroppings and scattered juniper trees. The heat was intense, but Tobias seemed unaffected by it, sitting easy in his saddle with the confidence of a man who belonged to this land. Around midday, he called a halt near a small spring that bubbled up from between rocks. "Water the horses," he said. "Rest a bit. We have another 6 hours ahead." Wilhelmina dismounted carefully, her legs already sore from the unaccustomed riding. She led her horse to the water and stood in the shade of a stunted oak, grateful for the respite from the sun. Tobias pulled some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag and offered her a share. "Not fancy, but it will keep you going." "Thank you." She took the food, but then faced a dilemma she had not fully considered. To eat, she would have to lift her veil, at least partially. She turned away from him, her back against the tree, and carefully raised the fabric just enough to bring the food to her mouth. If Tobias noticed or cared, he gave no sign. He sat on a rock, chewing his own meal and scanning the horizon with the alert watchfulness of a wild creature. "How long have you lived in the mountains?" Wilhelmina asked, partly to fill the silence, partly because she was genuinely curious. "Going on 8 years now. Do you not get lonely?" He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Sometimes. But people can be lonelier in a crowd than in the wilderness. At least out here, things are honest. A wolf does not pretend to be your friend before it bites." There was a weight of experience in those words, and Wilhelmina wondered what had driven him to such isolation. Did something happen to make you leave civilization? "Could ask you the same question," he said, turning those storm-gray eyes on her. "About the veil, I mean." She stiffened. "That is a private matter." "So is mine." They regarded each other for a long moment, and then Tobias nodded, as if they had reached an understanding. "We have both got our reasons. No need to pick at old wounds." They rode on through the afternoon, the land growing rougher and more beautiful with each passing mile. By evening, they reached a point where the trail split, one path leading higher into the mountains, the other angling west, toward what Tobias said was Mrs. Henderson's ranch. "We will camp here tonight," he said. "Make the ranch by tomorrow afternoon." He set up camp with quick efficiency, building a small fire, laying out bedrolls, and setting snares for small game. Wilhelmina tried to help but felt clumsy and useless compared to his practiced movements. He cooked a simple meal of beans and cornbread cooked in a skillet, and they ate as the stars began to appear overhead. The night sky in this wild country was like nothing Wilhelmina had ever seen. The stars were so thick and bright they seemed close enough to touch, and the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light. She sat by the fire, her veil still firmly in place, and stared upward in wonder. "First time this far from town?" Tobias asked. "Yes. First time this far from any town. I've spent most of my life in cities." "What brought you to Laredo?" "I needed a fresh start, somewhere no one knew me." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks. "Running from something or toward something?" "I suppose I was running," she admitted, "but I hoped I might find something worth moving toward." "You find it yet?" She considered the question. "I do not know. Perhaps." They fell silent again, but it was a companionable silence now, the quiet of two people who understood that some things did not need to be said. Wilhelmina found herself relaxing in a way she had not in years. There was something about Tobias Irving's solid, undemanding presence that made her feel safe. When she finally lay down on her bedroll, Tobias was still sitting by the fire, keeping watch. She drifted off to sleep with the sound of the night wind in the trees and the crackling of the flames, and for the first time in 12 years, she did not dream of the fire. They reached Mrs. Henderson's ranch the next afternoon. It was a modest spread with a small house, a barn, and a few outbuildings, all weathered by sun and wind. Mrs. Henderson's foreman, a taciturn man named Garrett, showed them to the storage shed where the supplies were waiting, crates of fabric, spools of thread, boxes of buttons and lace and ribbons that Mrs. Henderson had ordered from San Antonio. "Going to take 2 trips to get all this down," Tobias said, examining the load. "Or 1 trip with a wagon," Garrett said. "We got one you can borrow if you bring it back." Tobias nodded. "Fair enough." They spent the night at the ranch, Wilhelmina in the small guest room of the main house, and Tobias in the barn with the foreman. The next morning, they loaded the wagon and set out back toward Laredo. With the wagon, the trip would take longer, but Tobias did not seem concerned. He drove with the same easy confidence he did everything, the reins loose in his big hands, his eyes on the trail ahead. "You are good at this," Wilhelmina observed. "Living out here, taking care of yourself. Were you always?" "My pa was a trapper," Tobias said. "Grew up in the mountains further north in Colorado Territory. He taught me everything there was to know about surviving in wild country. When he died, I kept on doing what I knew." He glanced at her. "You are good with a needle, Mrs. Henderson says. Where did you learn?" "My mother was a seamstress. I learned at her knee. After she died, I took over her business." She paused, then added, "Until I could not anymore." "The fire?" She went rigid. "How did you know?" "Only thing that would make someone wear a veil for 12 years. You were burned." For a moment she could not breathe. No one had ever said it so plainly, so matter-of-factly. People whispered, speculated, but no one had ever just asked. "Yes," she said finally. "I was burned." "How bad?" She was surprised to find she wanted to tell him. Maybe it was the distance from her old life. Maybe it was the strange intimacy of the trail. Maybe it was simply that Tobias Irving asked as if he actually cared about the answer. "Half my face," she said quietly. "My left side, from forehead to jaw. The doctor said I was lucky to survive. I did not feel lucky. I felt like a monster." "You're not a monster. You have not seen me. Do not need to. I have seen how you move, how you carry yourself. I have heard your voice. You are not a monster, Wilhelmina Thorne. You are just someone who got hurt." Tears pricked at her eyes behind the veil. "People are frightened of me. People are frightened of anything they do not understand. Does not make them right." They rode in silence for a while, and then Wilhelmina said, "No one has ever spoken to me the way you do, like I'm normal. You are normal. You have just been hiding for a long time." Something shifted in Wilhelmina's chest, a loosening of a knot that had been there for 12 years. She looked at Tobias Irving, at his strong profile and his scarred hands and his long hair lifting in the wind, and she thought that maybe, just maybe, she had found what she had been running toward. They made camp that night by a creek that ran clear and cold even in the summer heat. Tobias caught fish with his bare hands, a skill that amazed Wilhelmina, and cooked them over the fire with some wild herbs he gathered from the bank. They ate as the sun set, painting the sky in impossible colors. "Tobias," she said hesitantly, using his given name for the first time. "May I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why did you really leave civilization? You said people can be lonely in a crowd. What did you mean?" He was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "I was engaged once," he said finally, "to a girl back in Colorado. Elizabeth was her name. Prettiest thing you ever saw, or so everyone said. I thought I loved her, thought she loved me. Then I found out she was seeing another man behind my back, a banker's son with money and prospects. She told me I was too rough, too wild, said I would never amount to anything." He paused. She was probably right, but it hurt just the same. So I left. Figured if I was going to be alone, I might as well be alone on my own terms. "She was wrong," Wilhelmina said firmly. "You are worth 10 of any banker's son. You are honest and strong and kind. She was a fool to let you go." He looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. "That's kind of you to say. It is not kindness. It is the truth." Something passed between them then, a current of understanding and attraction that Wilhelmina had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten what it was like. Her heart began to beat faster, and she saw Tobias's expression soften in a way she had not seen before. "Wilhelmina," he said, his voice rough, "can I ask you something now?" "Yes." Are you ever going to take that veil off?" The question hung in the air between them. Wilhelmina felt a surge of panic, but also something else, something that might have been hope. "I do not know if I can. I have worn it for so long. I do not even look at myself in mirrors anymore. I cannot bear to see what I have become." What if someone wanted to see? Someone who was not going to run or stare or pity you? Her hands began to shake. Why would anyone want that? He moved closer, slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might spook. "Because I would like to see the woman I am falling in love with." The world seemed to stop. The creek stopped babbling, the wind stopped blowing, even the fire stopped crackling. All Wilhelmina could hear was the pounding of her own heart. "You cannot mean that," she whispered. "I do not say things I do not mean." He was very close now, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. "I have known you 3 days, and I know more about you than I knew about Elizabeth after a year. You are brave and strong, and you have survived something that would have broken most people. That veil does not hide who you are, Wilhelmina. Not from me." "I am afraid," she said, and her voice broke. "I know, but you do not have to be afraid of me." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Tobias reached up and touched the edge of her veil where it hung down from her hat. His fingers were gentle, impossibly gentle for such a large, rough man. "May I?" She could not speak. She could barely breathe. But after a moment, she nodded. Tobias lifted the veil, slowly, carefully, as if it were made of spider silk. He raised it up and over the brim of her hat, letting it fall back, and for the first time in 12 years, Wilhelmina's face was bare to the eyes of another person. The scars were extensive, worse than she had described. The entire left side of her face was a mass of twisted, puckered skin, pulling at her eye and mouth, turning what had once been smooth and pretty into something that looked like melted wax. She kept her eyes closed, unable to bear seeing his reaction. "Wilhelmina," Tobias said softly, "look at me." She shook her head, tears streaming down both sides of her face, the damaged and the undamaged. "Please." Slowly, reluctantly, she opened her eyes, and what she saw in his face was not horror or disgust or pity. It was tenderness, it was warmth, it was love. "You are beautiful," he said. "Do not lie to me." "I'm not lying." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. His left hand rested on her scarred cheek, and he did not flinch, did not pull away. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." And then, gently, with a reverence that made her heart ache, Tobias Irving leaned down and kissed her. His lips touched her scarred cheek first, then her forehead, then the corner of her damaged mouth. And finally, he kissed her properly, deeply. And Wilhelmina felt something break open inside her, something she had locked away 12 years ago, and thought would never see light again. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Tobias rested his forehead against hers. "I mean it," he said. "Every word." "I believe you," she whispered. And she did. They sat by the fire for hours that night, Wilhelmina's veil forgotten, her face bare to the stars and to Tobias's steady gaze. They talked about everything and nothing, making up for years of loneliness with words that tumbled over each other in their eagerness to be spoken. Tobias told her about his childhood in the mountains, about his father's death from a bear attack when Tobias was just 16, about the years he spent trapping and hunting and learning to live alone. Wilhelmina told him about her mother's death when she was 17, about taking over the seamstress business, about the fire that started in the shop below her apartment, how she had barely escaped with her life, but lost her face in the process. "The doctors said I should be grateful," she said bitterly. "Said it could have been worse, but all I could think was that I would rather have died. It took me years to want to live again, and even then, I could not live the way I had before. I could not bear people looking at me, whispering about me. So I hid." "You do not have to hide anymore," Tobias said. "Not with me." But what about when we go back to town? People will stare. They will talk. Let them. Anyone who has a problem with how you look will have to answer to me. There was a fierce protectiveness in his voice that made Wilhelmina feel cherished in a way she had never experienced. You barely know me, she said, but there was no conviction in her words. I know enough. I know you are strong and kind and brave. I know I have been alone for 8 years, and in 3 days with you, I've felt more alive than I have in all that time. I know I want to keep feeling this way. I feel it too, she admitted. It terrifies me, but I feel it. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Then we will be terrified together. They made it back to Laredo 2 days later, and when they rolled into town with the wagon full of supplies, Wilhelmina's veil was still thrown back. At first, no one noticed. Then someone saw and pointed, and within minutes, it seemed like the entire town had turned out to stare. Wilhelmina felt her courage faltering, felt the old urge to hide, to cover her face and run. But Tobias was beside her, solid and immovable, and he reached over and took her hand in full view of everyone. You are all right, he said quietly. I have got you. She straightened her spine and looked straight ahead, past the gawking faces, past the whispers. They drove directly to Mrs. Henderson's shop, where the widow came out to inspect the supplies. Her eyes widened when she saw Wilhelmina's bare face, but to her credit, she smiled. About time, Mrs. Henderson said briskly. That veil was too heavy for this heat anyway. Come on, let us get these crates unloaded. Over the next few weeks, Laredo grew accustomed to seeing Wilhelmina Thorne's face. Some people stared, some whispered, but most simply accepted. And those who did not learned quickly to keep their opinions to themselves. After Tobias Irving, all 6 feet 4 inches and 230 pounds of him, made it clear that he would not tolerate disrespect toward the woman he loved. Because it was love, Wilhelmina realized. Real, deep, abiding love. Tobias came down from the mountains more and more frequently, always finding some excuse to be in town, to see her. They took walks together in the evening when the heat had broken. They had dinner at the hotel, ignoring the curious looks. They sat on the porch of Mrs. Henderson's shop and talked until the stars came out. One evening, about 2 months after their first trip to the ranch, Tobias arrived in town looking nervous. He was wearing clean clothes, his hair was freshly washed and tied back, and he was carrying something wrapped in cloth. Wilhelmina, he said when he found her closing up the shop. Can we talk? Of course. He led her to a quiet spot near the creek that ran along the edge of town, where willows provided shade and privacy. He seemed to be struggling with what to say, which was unusual for him. I've been thinking, he began, about the future, about what I want. And what do you want? She asked gently. I want you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and go to sleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you. I know I do not have much to offer. I live in a cabin in the mountains with no real comforts. I am rough and uneducated, and I will probably never be a rich man. But I love you, Wilhelmina. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And if you will have me, I would be honored to be your husband. He unwrapped the cloth, revealing a ring. It was simple, a silver band with a small turquoise stone, but it was clearly made with care. I made it myself, he said. Found the turquoise in a creek bed up in the mountains. It is not fancy, but it is honest, like us. Wilhelmina felt tears streaming down her face, the familiar sensation made new by the fact that she could feel them on her scarred skin, no longer hidden behind fabric. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you. The relief and joy that flooded Tobias's face was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made her knees weak. They were married 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Laredo. Mrs. Henderson stood up as Wilhelmina's witness, and the foreman Garrett stood for Tobias. Wilhelmina wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk that she had sewn herself, and no veil. Her scars were visible to everyone present, but she stood tall and proud beside the man she loved, and that was all that mattered. After the ceremony, Tobias took her back to his mountain cabin. It was a full day's ride from Laredo, up into the high country where the air was cool and pine trees grew thick. The cabin was rough but well built, a single large room with a loft, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over a valley so beautiful it took Wilhelmina's breath away. "It is not much," Tobias said anxiously, "but I can add on, make it bigger, make it a real home." "It is perfect," Wilhelmina said, and meant it. She had lived in fine houses in the city, but none of them had ever felt like home the way this rough mountain cabin did. Their first night as husband and wife was tender and sweet. Tobias was gentle with her, mindful of her scars, but Wilhelmina did not want gentleness born of pity. She wanted him to touch her as if she were whole, as if she were beautiful. And he did. He kissed every inch of her scarred face, traced the damaged skin with his fingers, and told her over and over that she was the most precious thing in his world. They built a life together in those mountains. Tobias trapped and hunted, providing meat and furs that he sold in town. Wilhelmina sewed, taking on commissions from Mrs. Henderson and from the ranchers' wives who were willing to make the trip up to the cabin or send their measurements. She also learned to do things she had never imagined: how to dress a deer, how to preserve food for the winter, how to chop wood and start a fire, and 100 other skills that mountain living required. It was hard work, but it was good work. And at the end of each day, there was Tobias, with his quiet strength and his gentle hands and his unwavering love. He had been right that first night by the fire. She was beautiful, not in spite of her scars, not even because of them, but simply because she was herself. And that was enough. Winter came early to the mountains that year. By November, snow was falling regularly, and by December, they were snowed in, cut off from the town below. But they were prepared. The cabin was well stocked with food and firewood, and they had each other. Wilhelmina found that she loved the winter, loved the silence of the snow, the warmth of the fire, the intimacy of being alone with her husband for weeks at a time. It was during that winter that she realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but it was not until she felt the first flutter of movement that she was certain. She told Tobias one night as they lay in bed, the fire crackling in the hearth, the wind howling outside. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. He went very still, then rolled over to face her, his eyes wide. "Are you certain?" "Yes." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming him from handsome to radiant. "A baby," he repeated, as if he could not quite believe it. Then he laughed, a sound of pure joy, and pulled her into his arms. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, even though she could see that he was. "Happy does not begin to cover it. I love you, Wilhelmina. I love you and our child. I'm going to take care of both of you, I promise." "I know you will." The rest of the winter passed in a haze of preparation. Tobias began work on an addition to the cabin, a second room that would serve as a nursery. He worked whenever the weather allowed, sawing and hammering with a determination that was almost comical. Wilhelmina sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart full of wonder at the thought of the life growing inside her. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it brought a profusion of wildflowers and new life. In early May, as the snow was finally melting from the highest peaks, Wilhelmina went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth. There was no doctor, no midwife, only Tobias with his steady hands and his calm voice talking her through the pain. For hours, Wilhelmina thought she might die, thought that after everything, this would be what finally broke her. But Tobias would not let her give up. "You are strong," he kept saying. "You are the strongest person I know. You can do this." And finally, after what felt like an eternity, their son was born. He came into the world screaming, red-faced and furious, and Tobias wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in Wilhelmina's arms, with tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Tobias said hoarsely. "You are both perfect." They named him Thomas after Tobias's father, and he was indeed perfect. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and he was strong and healthy despite the difficult birth. Wilhelmina had worried during her pregnancy about how she would feel seeing her child for the first time, whether her scars would make her feel like less of a mother. But the moment she held Thomas, all those fears vanished. She was his mother, and he was hers, and nothing else mattered. That summer, they made the trip down to Laredo to show off the baby. Mrs. Henderson cooed over him and pronounced him the finest baby she had ever seen. The townsfolk, who had grown used to seeing Wilhelmina's scarred face, now saw her as a mother, and somehow that shifted their perception even further. She was no longer the veiled woman or the poor, burned girl. She was Mrs. Irving, the mountain man's wife, and she carried herself with a confidence that commanded respect. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a sturdy little boy who loved the mountains as much as his father did. Tobias taught him to track animals, to identify plants, to read the weather in the sky. Wilhelmina taught him his letters and numbers, reading to him from the few books they owned until he could read them himself. When Thomas was 3, Wilhelmina gave birth to twin girls, Anna and Sarah. The birth was easier this time, and Tobias delivered them with the same steady competence he brought to everything. The girls were as different as night and day. Anna was bold and adventurous, always climbing trees and getting into mischief, while Sarah was quiet and thoughtful, preferring to sit with her mother and learn to sew. The cabin grew along with the family. Tobias added more rooms, a proper kitchen, a sleeping loft for the children. He built a barn for the horses and goats they acquired, a chicken coop, a root cellar. What had started as a rough mountain hideaway became a real home, filled with laughter and love. Wilhelmina continued to sew, but now her work was interspersed with the 1,000 tasks of motherhood. She baked bread and churned butter, taught her daughters to sew, and her son to mend his own clothes, doctored scrapes and bruises, and told stories by the fire on long winter nights. She had never imagined she could be this happy, this complete. Tobias remained the same rock-solid presence he had always been, the protector and provider of his family. He still trapped and hunted, still made regular trips to town to trade, but now he always hurried home, eager to be with his wife and children. He was a devoted father, patient and kind, but firm when he needed to be. He taught all 3 children to respect the wilderness, to take only what they needed, to leave the land better than they found it. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Tobias surprised Wilhelmina with a trip back to the spot where they had first camped together, where he had first lifted her veil. They left the children with Mrs. Henderson, who was delighted to spoil them for a few days, and rode up into the high country. It was summer, and the meadows were full of wildflowers. They made camp by the same creek, and as the sun set, they sat by the fire just as they had a decade before. "Do you remember?" Tobias asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Every moment," Wilhelmina said. "I remember being terrified. I remember thinking I could never let you see me." "And now?" She turned to look at him, this man who had given her back her life, who had shown her that she was worthy of love. "Now I cannot imagine hiding from you. You gave me so much, Tobias. You gave me myself." "You were always yourself," he said. "I just helped you see it." They made love under the stars that night, the same stars that had watched over them 10 years before, and Wilhelmina felt a deep gratitude for the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been burned, scarred, broken. She had hidden for 12 years, convinced she was a monster. And then a mountain man with gentle hands and a fierce heart had lifted her veil and shown her the truth. She was not defined by her scars. She was defined by her courage, her strength, her capacity to love and be loved. The years continued to unfold. Thomas grew into a tall, strong young man who looked more like his father every day. He took over more and more of the trapping and hunting, giving Tobias time to focus on other things, like teaching the twins to ride and helping Wilhelmina with the endless repairs that a mountain homestead required. When Thomas was 18, he began courting a girl from Laredo, the daughter of the blacksmith. Her name was Lucy, and she was sweet and pretty and not at all put off by the rough mountain life. Wilhelmina watched her son fall in love and felt a pang of bittersweet recognition. He would leave them soon, start his own life, and that was as it should be, but she would miss him. Anna, true to her adventurous nature, announced at 16 that she wanted to learn to be a veterinarian. It was an unusual ambition for a girl, but Tobias and Wilhelmina had never believed in limiting their children based on convention. They arranged for her to apprentice with the doctor in Laredo, who also treated animals, and Anna threw herself into her studies with characteristic determination. Sarah, the quietest of the 3, surprised everyone by revealing a talent for painting. She painted the mountains, the wildflowers, the animals, her family. Her work was beautiful, and Mrs. Henderson began selling her paintings in the dress shop. They became quite popular with tourists and travelers passing through Laredo, and Sarah earned enough money to buy herself fine brushes and paints from San Francisco. Wilhelmina and Tobias watched their children grow and thrive with deep satisfaction. They had built something lasting, something good. Their love had created not just children, but a legacy of kindness, strength, and resilience. On a warm spring day when Wilhelmina was 48 years old, 30 years after the fire that had changed her life, she stood on the porch of the cabin and looked out over the valley. The mountains were green with new growth, the sky was impossibly blue, and somewhere in the distance she could hear Tobias chopping wood. She touched her scarred face, something she did rarely now. The scars were still there, of course, they would always be there, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of her story, part of the journey that had brought her to this place, this life, this love. Tobias came around the corner of the cabin, his shirt damp with sweat, his hair now streaked with gray but still long. He was 56 now, and his body bore the marks of a life of hard work, but he was still strong, still capable, still the man she had fallen in love with by a campfire 30 years ago. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "About how lucky I am," she said. "About how close I came to never having this." He put his arm around her waist and pulled her close. "I'm the lucky one. I was just surviving before I met you. You taught me how to live. We taught each other." "Yes," he agreed. "We did." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun move across the sky, and Wilhelmina thought about the girl she had been, hiding behind a veil, convinced she was unlovable. That girl seemed like someone from another lifetime. She had been transformed not by the removal of the veil, but by the love of a good man who had seen past the surface to the person underneath. Thomas married Lucy that summer in a beautiful ceremony at the ranch where Wilhelmina and Tobias had first retrieved supplies all those years ago. The whole town turned out, and there was dancing and feasting that lasted until dawn. Wilhelmina danced with her son, then with her husband, and she was filled with such joy she thought she might burst. Anna completed her apprenticeship and set up practice in Laredo, becoming the first woman veterinarian in that part of Texas. She was brisk and competent and loved her work, and though she had suitors, she showed no interest in marrying. "I've got too much to do," she told her mother. "Maybe someday, but not yet." Sarah's paintings began to attract attention from galleries in San Antonio and even Houston. She received a commission to paint a series of landscapes for a wealthy rancher, and the money she earned allowed her to travel, to see other parts of the country and paint them too. But she always came back to the mountains, to the cabin where she had grown up, because that was home. Grandchildren came in time. Thomas and Lucy had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and they were all as lively and bright as their parents. Wilhelmina and Tobias made regular trips down to visit, and sometimes the grandchildren came up to the cabin to stay for weeks at a time, learning the same lessons their father had learned about living in the wild. As Wilhelmina and Tobias grew older, they did not slow down so much as shift their focus. Tobias still hunted and trapped, but less frequently. He spent more time on the porch, whittling and watching the valley. Wilhelmina still sewed, but she also wrote, putting down on paper the story of her life, of the fire and the veil and the mountain man who had loved her despite everything. They were not wealthy in terms of money, but they were rich in everything that mattered: family, love, respect, contentment. They had built a life together that was honest and true, rooted in the land and in each other. On a cool autumn evening when Wilhelmina was 62 years old, 42 years after the fire, she and Tobias sat on the porch as they had done countless times before. The children were all grown and gone, pursuing their own lives, and the cabin was quiet. But it was a good quiet, the quiet of 2 people who had said everything that needed to be said, and now could simply exist together in peace. "Tobias," Wilhelmina said suddenly, "do you remember the first thing you said to me after you lifted my veil?" He thought for a moment, then smiled. "I said you were beautiful, and I did not believe you." "I know." "I believe you now," she said softly. "It took me years, but I believe you. You gave me that, along with everything else. You gave me the ability to see myself through your eyes, to understand that I am more than my scars." He reached over and took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that was beginning to stiffen his joints. You gave me just as much. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain, to be part of the world again. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. You gave me love when I thought I would never find it. We saved each other, she said. Yes, we did. They sat in silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. Somewhere in the valley, a wolf howled, and Tobias smiled at the familiar sound. This was their world, the world they had built together from nothing but determination and love. Years continued to pass, each one marked by the rhythms of the seasons and the milestones of their growing family. More grandchildren came, and then great-grandchildren. The cabin became a gathering place, a homestead, where multiple generations came together to celebrate holidays and mark important occasions. Anna eventually did marry, a veterinarian from San Antonio, who came to Laredo to learn from her. They had a partnership based on mutual respect and shared passion for their work, and they had one daughter who inherited her mother's fierce independence and her grandfather's love of the wild. Sarah's paintings became famous enough that a gallery in New York requested an exhibition. She went, saw the city, was feted and celebrated, and then promptly came home to the mountains because, as she told her parents, nothing in New York is half as beautiful as what we have here. Thomas took over the homestead gradually as Tobias grew older, expanding it into a working ranch that provided income for multiple families. He was a good boss and a fair man, and he treated the land with the respect his father had taught him. When Tobias was 78 years old, he fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Wilhelmina nursed him through it, sitting by his bedside day and night, forcing broth down his throat and keeping the fire stoked. For a week, they thought they would lose him, but his mountain-bred constitution pulled him through. He was weaker after that, but not defeated. He continued to chop wood and tend to the animals, just moving a bit slower. Wilhelmina, for her part, remained remarkably healthy. Her scars had faded somewhat with age, though they were still visible. But by now, they were simply part of her face, no more remarkable than the wrinkles around her eyes or the gray in her hair. When she looked in the mirror, which she did regularly now, she saw a woman who had lived a full life, who had loved and been loved, who had survived and thrived. The scars were part of that story, but they were not the whole story, not even close. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the homestead. All 3 of their children were there, along with all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a crowd so large they had to set up tables outside. There was food and music and laughter, and in the middle of it all sat Wilhelmina and Tobias, watching their legacy unfold around them. Thomas stood up to make a toast. He was 53 now, still strong, but with gray in his beard and lines around his eyes. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love is not about perfection, but about seeing the truth in each other and choosing it anyway. Who showed us that strength comes in many forms, and the strongest form is the courage to be vulnerable. Who built a life out of nothing but determination and love, and gave us all a foundation to build our own lives on. Happy anniversary, Ma and Pa. We love you." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Wilhelmina felt tears streaming down her face. Tobias squeezed her hand and leaned over to whisper in her ear, 50 years, and I would do it all again." "So would I," she whispered back, "every single day." They danced that night, slow and careful on their old bones, but still together, still in love. And as Wilhelmina rested her head on Tobias's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, she thought about the girl behind the veil, the girl who had thought she was a monster. She wished she could go back and tell that girl that everything would be all right, that there was a mountain man waiting in her future, who would lift that veil gently and kiss what was underneath, who would show her that she was worthy of love and happiness and all the good things life had to offer. But that girl was gone, transformed into this woman, this wife, this mother and grandmother and great-grandmother. And that woman knew with absolute certainty that she had lived a good life, a life worth living. The fire had taken her face, but it had not taken her future. That she had built herself, with help from a mountain man who had loved her when she could not love herself. When Tobias was 82 and Wilhelmina was 72, he passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold winter night. He went to bed beside his wife as he had for 55 years and simply did not wake up. Wilhelmina lay beside him for a long time that morning, holding his hand, memorizing the lines of his face, saying goodbye to the man who had been her entire world. They buried him on the mountain, in a spot he had picked out years before, with a view of the valley and the cabin they had built together. The whole family came, even the great-grandchildren, and they stood in the snow and said goodbye to the patriarch who had loved them all so fiercely. Wilhelmina grieved, but she did not break. She had been broken once by fire, and Tobias had helped her heal. Now he was gone, but the healing remained. She was strong enough to withstand this loss, to carry on without him. She lived for another 8 years, staying in the cabin with Thomas and Lucy nearby to help as she grew frailer. She sewed less, but wrote more, finishing the story of her life that would eventually be published and read by people all over the country. She spent time with her great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their great-grandfather, about the mountains, about surviving and thriving against all odds. And every night she looked at the empty place beside her in bed and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for everything." When Wilhelmina Thorne Irving passed away at the age of 80, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her face was peaceful. The veil she had worn for 12 years had been folded away in a trunk decades ago, a relic of a different life. She died as she had lived her last 50 years, unashamed, unafraid, and deeply loved. They buried her beside Tobias on the mountain, and on her headstone they carved the words Thomas had chosen. She was beautiful. And she was. The cabin still stands, maintained by Thomas's children and grandchildren. It has become a homestead that has been passed down through generations, a reminder of the love that built it and the family that grew from that love. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, people say they can still feel the presence of Tobias and Wilhelmina, the mountain man and his veiled bride, watching over the valley they loved. Their story became legend in Laredo and the surrounding country, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But for those who knew them, for the family they left behind, it was not myth. It was simply the truth, that love can heal, that courage can overcome, and that sometimes the gentlest act, like lifting a veil and kissing what lies beneath, can change everything. The mountains remain, constant and eternal. The cabin stands strong, and the legacy of Wilhelmina and Tobias Irving lives on in the descendants who carry their strength, their courage, and their capacity for love. A love that began beside a campfire in the wild Texas country when a mountain man looked past the veil to see the woman beneath and chose her, scars and all. That is how love stories should end. Not with perfection, but with truth. Not with ease, but with perseverance. Not with surfaces, but with depths. Wilhelmina wore a veil for 12 years, and when Tobias Irving lifted it gently and kissed what was underneath, he found not a monster, but a woman. A strong, brave, beautiful woman who would become his wife, his partner, his love. Together, they built a life that proved scars do not define us. Love does. And that love, once found, can transform everything.